When 5-year-old Rebecca disappeared from her Amish community in 1985, her family thought they'd lost her forever. While mainstream media forgot this case, the mystery only deepened. 9 years later, her handmade doll surfaced at a market stall. But how? The vendor claimed no memory of acquiring it, yet forensic evidence revealed something disturbing. What investigators discovered next would challenge everything they thought they knew about Rebecca's disappearance. But first, we need to understand what really happened that autumn morning in 1985. Before we dive into this strange case, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. It's incredible how far these mysteries reach. October 15th, 1985. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. In the heart of Amish country, 6-year-old Rebecca Miller woke before dawn, just like every other day. Her family's farmhouse sat quietly among the fields, where horses grazed and corn stalks swayed in the cool autumn breeze. But this morning would be different from all the others. Rebecca's mother, Mary Miller, prepared breakfast while her father, Samuel, headed to the barn for morning chores. The Amish community of Greenfield had always been a safe haven. Children played freely, neighbors trusted each other, and doors rarely needed locks. Crime was almost unheard of in their peaceful world. That sense of safety was about to shatter forever. Rebecca grabbed her favorite possession, a handmade doll with a red dress and black yarn hair. Her grandmother had sewn it with love, using fabric scraps from the family's clothing. The doll never left Rebecca's side. Rebecca's daily routine was simple and predictable. After breakfast, she would help her mother with small chores around the house. Then she would play in the yard while her older brothers worked in the fields. The Miller family lived by the old ways, without electricity or modern conveniences, but tradition couldn't protect them from what was coming. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Rebecca ate her oatmeal and helped clear the table. She carried her red-dressed doll everywhere, whispering secrets to it and tucking it under her arm. Mary Miller would later remember how happy Rebecca seemed that morning. It would be the last time anyone saw her smile. Around 9 a.m., Rebecca asked if she could play by the creek behind their property. It was a spot she knew well, where she often collected smooth stones and watched minnows swim. Her mother agreed, reminding her to stay close and come back when she heard the dinner bell. 2 hours passed. Mary Miller rang the dinner bell, its sound echoing across the fields. She waited, listening for Rebecca's footsteps on the porch. But silence filled the air. Mary called Rebecca's name, walking toward the creek where her daughter had gone to play. What she found there would haunt her forever. Rebecca's small footprints led to the creek's edge, then simply vanished. No signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no screams heard by neighbors, just empty space where a little girl should have been. Mary's heart pounded as she searched the tall grass and called Rebecca's name over and over. But Rebecca was gone. And something else was missing too. The red-dressed doll was nowhere to be found. Rebecca never went anywhere without it, not even to the outhouse. The absence of both the child and her beloved toy created a mystery that would puzzle investigators for decades. Had Rebecca taken the doll with her, or had someone else? Samuel Miller raced home when he heard his wife's frantic calls. Within minutes, the entire Amish community mobilized. Men on horseback spread across the countryside, while women organized search parties on foot. The English neighbors joined the effort, bringing cars and modern equipment the Amish couldn't use. But their efforts only deepened the mystery. Police arrived from Lancaster City, led by Detective John Harrison. He had worked missing person cases before, but nothing prepared him for the unique challenges of investigating in Amish country. The community's separation from modern technology meant no phone records, no security cameras, no digital trail to follow. And the physical evidence told a strange story. At the creek, investigators found Rebecca's footprints clearly preserved in the soft mud. The prints showed she had been walking slowly, not running. There were no other footprints nearby, no tire tracks, no signs of a vehicle. It was as if Rebecca had simply vanished into thin air. Detective Harrison interviewed everyone who knew Rebecca. Her teacher described her as quiet and well-behaved. Her friend said she never talked to strangers and always stayed close to home. The Amish community, though private by nature, cooperated fully with the investigation, but their answers only raised more questions. Several neighbors reported seeing a dark pickup truck in the area that morning. However, their descriptions didn't match. Some said it was blue, others black. One witness claimed to see a man in the driver's seat, while another insisted it was a woman. The conflicting accounts frustrated investigators. Then came the first truly disturbing discovery. 3 days after Rebecca vanished, searchers found her prayer cap caught on a fence post 2 miles from the creek. The small white bonnet was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. Laboratory tests would later confirm it was indeed Rebecca's blood, though not enough to indicate serious injury. Tips poured in from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Someone claimed to see Rebecca at a truck stop in Ohio. Another caller reported a girl matching her description at a shopping mall in New Jersey. Each lead sent investigators racing across state lines only to find nothing. But one tip would prove more disturbing than all the others. A woman in Philadelphia called police, claiming she had seen Rebecca in her neighborhood. She described the child perfectly, down to the traditional Amish dress and the red doll she carried. Police rushed to the location but found no trace of either the girl or the caller who had provided a fake name. The hoax revealed something chilling about the case. Someone out there knew intimate details about Rebecca's disappearance. They knew about the doll, which police had kept secret from the media. This meant either the caller was directly involved or information was leaking from somewhere within the investigation. Trust began to break down on all sides. Weeks turned into months. The Amish community of Greenfield had never experienced anything like this. Their children, once free to roam the countryside, were now kept close to home. Parents walked their kids to school and watched them constantly. The innocence of their simple life had been shattered. But their faith would face an even greater test. Mary Miller refused to give up hope. She kept Rebecca's room exactly as it was, with the small bed made neatly and toys arranged on the shelf. Samuel struggled with anger and grief, emotions that conflicted with his Amish beliefs about forgiveness and acceptance of God's will. Then winter arrived, bringing a new kind of despair. Snow covered the fields where search parties had walked. The creek froze solid, hiding any remaining clues beneath layers of ice. As 1985 turned into 1986, Rebecca Miller's case grew cold. The file moved from Detective Harrison's desk to a storage room, joining hundreds of other unsolved cases. The media attention faded quickly. Rebecca's story was replaced by other tragedies, other mysteries. The Amish community, already private by nature, retreated further from the outside world. They held their pain close, sharing it only with each other in quiet moments and whispered prayers. But someone, somewhere, was holding a terrible secret. Detective Harrison retired in 1991, but he never forgot Rebecca Miller. He kept a copy of her file at home, reviewing it every few months. The case had consumed him, driving him to work countless unpaid hours and follow leads that led nowhere. His wife worried about his obsession. He had no idea that the breakthrough was coming. By 1993, Rebecca would have been 14 years old. Her parents aged rapidly, their faces lined with worry and grief. They had tried to have another child, but Mary suffered 2 miscarriages. The shadow of Rebecca's disappearance seemed to touch everything in their lives. September 18, 1994. Helen Kaufman was browsing the weekly farmers market in Bird in Hand, a small town 20 miles from Greenfield. She collected antique dolls and often found treasures at these rural markets. Her eye was drawn to a small stall run by an elderly Amish woman. What she saw there would restart a cold case. Among the handmade quilts and wooden toys, sat a child's doll. It had a red dress and black yarn hair, exactly like traditional Amish dolls. But something about this particular doll caught Helen's attention. The stitching was unusual, and the fabric looked familiar. Then she remembered where she had seen it before. Helen had been following Rebecca Miller's case since 1985. She remembered the newspaper photos and the descriptions of the missing doll. Her hands shook as she picked up the toy. The fabric was faded now, but the red dress was unmistakable. This was Rebecca's doll. Helen approached the elderly vendor, trying to keep her voice steady. "This doll is beautiful," she said casually. "Did you make it yourself?" The woman, who introduced herself as Ruth Stoltzfus, smiled and shook her head. She explained that she had found the doll among her late sister's belongings, but her story didn't add up. Ruth claimed her sister had been a skilled seamstress who made dolls for local children. She had passed away the previous winter, and Ruth was selling her crafts to help pay for the funeral. It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but Helen noticed something odd. The doll showed signs of recent play. While the fabric was faded, the doll's hair had been recently braided. The dress had been mended with newer thread. Someone had been caring for this doll, playing with it, loving it. Helen purchased the doll for $20 and immediately drove to the Lancaster County Police Station. Detective Sarah Chen had just joined the Lancaster County Police Department's cold case unit. She was young, ambitious, and eager to prove herself. When Helen Kaufman walked into the station carrying a small doll, Chen's interest was immediately piqued. The doll would consume the next 2 years of her life. Chen pulled Rebecca Miller's file from storage and studied every detail. The original description of the doll matched perfectly. Red dress, black yarn hair, distinctive stitching pattern. Even the small repairs mentioned in the file were visible on the doll Helen had found. But forensic science had advanced since 1985. Chen sent the doll to the state crime lab for DNA analysis. The technology that hadn't existed during the original investigation might finally provide answers. She also requested fingerprint analysis and fiber comparison tests. If Rebecca had been the last person to touch this doll, science might be able to prove it. 3 weeks later, the lab results arrived. Detective Chen opened the envelope with trembling hands. The DNA evidence was conclusive. Rebecca Miller's genetic material was found on the doll's clothing and hair. But that wasn't the shocking part. The doll also contained DNA from someone else. Mixed with Rebecca's DNA was genetic material from an unknown individual. The lab technician noted that the unknown DNA was relatively fresh, suggesting contact within the past few years. Someone had been handling Rebecca's doll long after she disappeared. The fingerprint analysis revealed something even more disturbing. Multiple sets of fingerprints were found on the doll. Rebecca's were there as expected, but there were also prints from at least 3 other people. One set belonged to Helen Kaufman, who had found the doll. Another set matched Ruth Stoltzfus, the vendor, but the third set was unidentified and didn't match anyone in the criminal database. Detective Chen drove to Ruth Stoltzfus's farm the next morning. The elderly Amish woman seemed nervous when Chen showed her badge. She invited the detective inside, but kept glancing toward the door, as if planning an escape. Ruth's story began to crumble under questioning. When Chen asked about the doll again, Ruth changed her story. Now she claimed she had found it in her barn, not among her sister's belongings. She couldn't explain how it had gotten there or how long it had been there. Her hands shook as she served tea. Then Chen revealed what forensics had found. "Mrs. Stoltzfus," Chen said quietly, "your fingerprints are on this doll. But so are the fingerprints of the missing child and someone else we haven't identified yet. I need you to tell me the truth about how you got this doll." Ruth's face went pale, and she began to weep. Through her tears, Ruth Stoltzfus told a story that shattered Detective Chen's assumptions about the case. She hadn't found the doll in her barn or among her sister's belongings. Someone had brought it to her 3 months earlier, asking her to repair the torn dress and replace the worn hair. That someone was still alive. Ruth described a woman in her 40s who had approached her at the market. The woman said the doll belonged to her daughter and needed fixing. She paid Ruth $50 for the repair work, far more than the job was worth. Ruth thought it was odd but didn't ask questions. The woman had made a disturbing request. She asked Ruth to sell the doll at the market after the repairs were finished. She said her daughter had outgrown it and wanted to find it a new home. Ruth agreed, thinking it was a kind gesture. She had no idea she was handling evidence from a missing child case. Ruth provided a detailed description of the mysterious woman. Medium height, brown hair, wearing plain clothes that weren't quite Amish but weren't modern either. She spoke with a slight accent that Ruth couldn't place. Most importantly, she had driven an old pickup truck, the same type of truck witnesses had reported in 1985. Detective Chen showed Ruth a photo lineup that included women from the original investigation. Ruth immediately pointed to one photo, though she wasn't entirely certain. The woman looked older now, but the facial features seemed familiar. The photo was of someone who had never been a suspect. The woman Ruth identified was Margaret Brennan, a social worker who had helped with the original search efforts in 1985. She had been considered a helpful witness, not a suspect. She had access to details about the case and had been present during many of the searches. Detective Chen began a careful investigation into Margaret Brennan's background. On the surface, she seemed like an unlikely suspect. She had worked as a social worker for 15 years, helping troubled families and missing children. Her supervisors praised her dedication and compassion. But her personal life told a different story. Brennan had never married and had no children of her own. Co-workers described her as lonely and sometimes overly attached to the children in her cases. She had been reprimanded twice for maintaining contact with families after cases were closed. Her connection to the Amish community ran deeper than anyone realized. Chen discovered that Brennan had been raised in a strict religious community in Ohio. She had left at age 18 after a conflict with her family. Several former neighbors described her as troubled and obsessed with the idea of having a perfect family. Chen organized a careful surveillance operation on Margaret Brennan. The social worker lived alone in a small house outside Lancaster, surrounded by farmland. She kept to herself and rarely had visitors. Chen's team watched her daily routines, looking for any sign of unusual behavior. What they found was beyond their expectations. Brennan maintained an elaborate garden behind her house, but hidden among the flowers and vegetables was something that made Chen's blood run cold. A small playhouse, painted bright colors and filled with toys suitable for a young child. The toys were all from the 1980s. Chen obtained a search warrant based on the doll evidence and Ruth Stoltzfus's identification. As they prepared to search Brennan's property, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally close to solving Rebecca Miller's disappearance. But she also feared what they might find. On a gray October morning in 1994, exactly 9 years after Rebecca's disappearance, police surrounded Margaret Brennan's house. Chen knocked on the front door while other officers secured the property. Brennan answered, looking surprisingly calm for someone about to be searched. She had been expecting them. "I suppose you're here about the doll," Brennan said quietly. She offered no resistance as officers entered her home. Chen was struck by how normal everything looked, clean, organized, with photos of children from her social work cases on the walls. But the basement told a different story. The basement had been converted into a child's room, pink walls, stuffed animals, and a small bed with Amish-style quilts. On a shelf sat more dolls, all handmade in the traditional Amish style. But these dolls were different from Rebecca's. They were newer, and they all had blonde hair instead of black. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Margaret Brennan confessed to taking Rebecca Miller. She sat in the police station's interview room, speaking in a voice so quiet that Chen had to lean forward to hear her words. Her confession was both heartbreaking and horrifying. She had been planning it for months. Brennan admitted that she had been watching the Miller family since early 1985. She knew their routines, knew when Rebecca played alone by the creek. She had been present during the search not to help, but to monitor the investigation and ensure she wasn't suspected. But her reason for taking Rebecca was the most disturbing part. Brennan explained that she had always wanted a daughter, but could never have children of her own. She had convinced herself that Rebecca would be better off with her, away from what she called the restrictive Amish lifestyle. She had planned to raise Rebecca as her own child. Brennan described how she had approached Rebecca at the creek that October morning. She had told the child that her mother was hurt and needed help. Rebecca, trusting and innocent, had followed Brennan to her truck without resistance. The entire kidnapping had taken less than 5 minutes. But Rebecca never stopped trying to escape. Brennan kept Rebecca in her basement, which she had prepared months in advance. She had bought children's clothes, toys, and books. She had even enrolled Rebecca in a school in another county under a false name. But Rebecca refused to cooperate with her new life. The child never stopped asking for her family. For weeks, Rebecca cried for her mother and father. She wouldn't eat the food Brennan prepared and wouldn't sleep in the bed she had made. She clutched her red doll constantly, the only connection to her real family. Brennan grew frustrated with Rebecca's resistance to her rescue. Detective Chen's voice was steady as she asked the question everyone dreaded: what happened to Rebecca? Brennan's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she described the night that changed everything. It was November 15th, 1985, exactly 1 month after the kidnapping. Rebecca had been sick with a fever for 2 days. Brennan, afraid to take her to a hospital where questions might be asked, tried to treat the child herself. But Rebecca's condition worsened. She became delirious, calling for her mother over and over. Brennan's next words would haunt Chen forever. "She died in my arms," Brennan whispered. "I tried to save her, but I couldn't take her to a doctor. I couldn't risk losing her. I held her until morning, hoping she would get better. But she never woke up. The fever had developed into pneumonia, and without proper medical care, 6-year-old Rebecca Miller had died." Brennan confessed to burying Rebecca in the woods behind her house. She had wrapped the child's body in one of the quilts from the basement room and carried her to a spot she had chosen weeks earlier. The grave was shallow, hidden beneath a fallen log, but she had kept something back. Brennan couldn't bring herself to bury Rebecca's beloved doll. It was the only thing that had comforted the child during her captivity. She kept it in the basement room, along with the other dolls she had made in Rebecca's memory. For 9 years, she had cared for the doll as if it were alive. The doll had become her connection to the child she had killed. Brennan visited the grave every day, bringing flowers and talking to Rebecca as if she could hear. She had lived with the guilt and loneliness for nearly a decade, creating an elaborate fantasy where she was still caring for a child who had died because of her actions. Armed with Brennan's confession, investigators located Rebecca's grave exactly where she had described. The forensic team worked carefully to excavate the remains, treating the site with the respect and dignity that Rebecca deserved. Her parents were notified before the news reached the media. What they found confirmed Brennan's story. Rebecca's skeletal remains were wrapped in a deteriorated quilt that matched the description from Brennan's basement. The forensic pathologist confirmed that the child had died from pneumonia, just as Brennan had claimed. There were no signs of physical abuse or violence, but the tragedy went deeper than anyone had imagined. Dental records confirmed that these were indeed Rebecca Miller's remains. The child who had vanished on that autumn morning in 1985 had been less than 5 miles from her family's farm the entire time. She had died alone, afraid, and calling for her mother, while her parents searched desperately for any sign of their missing daughter. News of Rebecca's discovery spread quickly through the Amish community of Greenfield. The Miller family requested privacy as they prepared for the funeral they had never been able to hold. The community rallied around them, offering support and comfort in their time of grief. But the revelation brought new pain along with closure. Knowing that Rebecca had died so young, so close to home, and under such preventable circumstances, made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. If Brennan had sought medical help, Rebecca might have survived the pneumonia. Fear of exposure had cost a child her life. The community struggled with questions of forgiveness. The Amish belief in forgiveness was put to the ultimate test. How do you forgive someone who took your child and let her die? Mary and Samuel Miller faced the most difficult decision of their lives, whether to visit Margaret Brennan in prison and offer the forgiveness their faith demanded. Margaret Brennan was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and manslaughter. She pleaded guilty to all charges, refusing to mount any defense. During her sentencing hearing, she addressed the Miller family directly, though they were not present in the courtroom. Her words revealed the depth of her delusion. "I loved Rebecca," Brennan said. "I wanted to give her a better life. I never meant for her to die. I would have done anything to save her." The judge noted that Brennan still seemed to believe she had been helping Rebecca, even after 9 years of reflection. The sentence was less than many expected. Due to her cooperation and the lack of evidence of intentional harm, Brennan was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Miller family felt the sentence was too light, but they accepted it as part of God's plan. They had their daughter back, and that was what mattered most. Rebecca Miller was finally laid to rest in the Amish cemetery, where generations of her family were buried. The simple wooden coffin was surrounded by hundreds of mourners from the community and beyond. The service was conducted in German, following traditional Amish customs. But this funeral was different from others. The story of Rebecca's disappearance and her recovery had touched people far beyond the Amish community. Non-Amish neighbors, police officers, and even strangers who had followed the case came to pay their respects. The small cemetery had never seen such a crowd. Mary Miller made a decision that surprised everyone. At the graveside, Mary Miller spoke publicly for the first time since her daughter's disappearance. She thanked everyone who had helped search for Rebecca and asked for prayers for Margaret Brennan. Her act of forgiveness was reported in newspapers across the country, inspiring others facing similar tragedies. Rebecca's red doll was returned to the Miller family after the trial. Mary Miller held it close, imagining her daughter's small hands playing with it during those final weeks. The doll had been Rebecca's companion through the most frightening time of her life. But its journey wasn't over. The Miller family decided to donate the doll to a museum dedicated to missing children. They wanted Rebecca's story to help other families facing similar tragedies. The doll became a symbol of hope and remembrance, a reminder that some missing children do come home. The doll carried one final secret. Inside the doll's stuffing, investigators found a small piece of paper with Rebecca's handwriting. It was a note to her parents, written during her captivity. "I love you, Mama and Papa. I want to come home." The note had been hidden in the doll's body, perhaps Rebecca's way of sending a message to her family. Margaret Brennan adjusted poorly to prison life. She spent most of her time alone, avoiding contact with other inmates. The prison psychologist noted her continued delusions about having saved Rebecca from the Amish lifestyle. She showed little genuine remorse for her actions. But she wasn't the only one suffering. The prison staff reported that Brennan talked to imaginary children, maintaining conversations with Rebecca and other children from her social work cases. She had created an elaborate fantasy world where she was still caring for children who needed her help. Her case files revealed a disturbing pattern. During her career as a social worker, Brennan had been involved in 12 cases involving missing or endangered children. Investigators began reviewing each case, looking for any connection to her crime. While no other kidnappings were discovered, several families reported that Brennan had maintained inappropriate contact with their children. Detective Chen's work on the Rebecca Miller case was far from over. She continued investigating Margaret Brennan's background, trying to understand how a social worker tasked with protecting children had become a kidnapper. The answers she found were disturbing. Brennan's childhood had been marked by tragedy. Records from Ohio revealed that Brennan had been removed from her parents' home at age 16 due to severe abuse. She had spent 2 years in foster care before aging out of the system. Her obsession with saving children seemed to stem from her own traumatic experiences, but trauma didn't excuse her actions. Chen interviewed Brennan's former colleagues and supervisors. Several admitted they had noticed warning signs but had failed to act. Brennan's excessive attachment to children in her cases, her reluctance to close cases, and her inappropriate contact with families had all been documented but ignored. The Rebecca Miller case exposed serious flaws in the child protection system. Margaret Brennan had been allowed to continue working with vulnerable children despite multiple red flags. Her supervisors had failed to recognize the signs of someone who posed a danger to the children she was supposed to protect. The consequences reached far beyond one case. A state investigation was launched into the Social Services Department where Brennan had worked. Several administrators were suspended, and new protocols were implemented to monitor social workers' interactions with families. Rebecca's death had prevented other potential tragedies, but the changes came too late for one family. The Miller family sued the state, arguing that proper oversight of Margaret Brennan could have prevented Rebecca's kidnapping and death. The case was settled out of court, with the money going to a foundation dedicated to finding missing children. The Millers wanted to ensure that no other family would suffer as they had. Rebecca Miller's case changed how missing children cases were investigated. The 9-year gap between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains highlighted the importance of never giving up on cold cases. Police departments across the country began reviewing their unsolved cases with fresh eyes. The case also changed the Amish community. The insular community had always been suspicious of outsiders, but Rebecca's case reinforced their beliefs about the dangers of the modern world. Children were watched more closely, and families became even more protective of their privacy. The tragedy had deepened their separation from mainstream society, but it also brought unexpected connections. Some Amish families began working more closely with law enforcement, recognizing that their isolation could put their children at risk. The Miller family became advocates for missing children, despite their religious beliefs about avoiding publicity. They wanted Rebecca's story to help other families. 5 years after Rebecca's case was solved, a documentary filmmaker approached the Miller family about telling their story. Initially reluctant, they eventually agreed, hoping the film would help other families facing similar tragedies. The documentary won several awards and brought national attention to the case, but it also brought unwanted attention. The film attracted the attention of other criminals who became fascinated with Margaret Brennan's crime. Police reported an increase in attempted kidnappings of Amish children in the months following the documentary's release. The very story meant to help had created new dangers. The Miller family faced a difficult decision. They could continue speaking publicly about Rebecca's case, potentially helping other families, but also putting their community at risk. Or they could return to their private life, letting others tell their daughter's story. The choice would define how Rebecca's legacy would be remembered. Margaret Brennan was released from prison in 2009 after serving 14 years of her 15-year sentence. She had been a model prisoner, participating in therapy programs and maintaining a clean disciplinary record. But her release was not welcomed by everyone. The Miller family was not notified of her release. Due to a clerical error, the victim notification system failed to alert the Miller family that their daughter's killer was being released. They learned about it from a newspaper article, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. The family felt betrayed by the system once again. Brennan's freedom came with strict conditions. She was prohibited from living within 50 miles of any Amish community. She was required to register as a child abuser and report to a probation officer weekly. She was also forbidden from working with children in any capacity. But monitoring her compliance proved difficult. Margaret Brennan struggled to adjust to life outside prison. She moved to a small apartment in a city far from Lancaster County, where she worked as a night janitor at an office building. She had no friends, no family, and no support system. The world had changed dramatically during her incarceration. But she hadn't changed. Brennan's probation officer reported that she still spoke about Rebecca as if the child were alive. She maintained a shrine to Rebecca in her apartment, with photos and toys arranged around a replica of the red doll. Her mental health was deteriorating, but she refused treatment. Then, she violated her probation. In 2011, Brennan was found at a playground, watching children play. When questioned by police, she claimed she was just enjoying the sunshine, but witnesses reported that she had been approaching young girls, asking them about their dolls. She was arrested and returned to prison. Margaret Brennan was charged with violating her probation and stalking. During the trial, psychologists testified that she was living in a fantasy world where she was still caring for Rebecca. She believed the child was lonely and needed friends, which explained her behavior at the playground. The testimony revealed the extent of her delusion. Dr. Patricia Wells, a forensic psychologist, explained that Brennan had developed a complex set of beliefs about Rebecca's continued existence. She believed the child had been reincarnated and was searching for her among other children. Her mental illness had progressed significantly during her years in prison. The judge faced a difficult decision. Brennan was clearly mentally ill and posed a potential danger to children, but her actions at the playground hadn't harmed anyone. The judge had to balance public safety with the rights of someone who was obviously struggling with severe mental health issues. Margaret Brennan was sentenced to 5 additional years in prison for violating her probation. This time, she was placed in a facility with a psychiatric unit where she could receive treatment for her mental illness. The Miller family felt some relief knowing she was back behind bars, but treatment revealed disturbing new details. Under psychiatric care, Brennan began sharing memories she had suppressed for decades. She spoke about other children she had wanted to help during her career as a social worker. While no additional crimes were discovered, her fantasies about kidnapping children went back much further than anyone had realized. She would never be truly free again. The combination of her mental illness and history of child endangerment meant that Brennan would likely spend the rest of her life under some form of supervision. Even if she were eventually released, she would be monitored constantly. The system had learned from its earlier failures. The Miller family never fully recovered from Rebecca's loss. Mary and Samuel aged beyond their years, their faces marked by decades of grief. They had 2 more children after Rebecca's death, but they never spoke about their lost daughter in front of the younger children, protecting them from the family's darkest chapter. But Rebecca's memory lived on in unexpected ways. The foundation created in Rebecca's name had helped locate dozens of missing children over the years. Her story had inspired new laws requiring better oversight of social workers and improved protocols for missing children cases. In death, Rebecca had become a guardian angel for other endangered children. The family made one final decision about their privacy. After years of media attention and documentary requests, the Miller family chose to retreat completely from public life. They moved to a more remote Amish community where they could grieve in peace. They had shared their story long enough. Now they wanted to remember Rebecca quietly. Detective Sarah Chen built her career on the Rebecca Miller case. She became a specialist in cold cases involving missing children, eventually heading her own department. She credited Rebecca's case with teaching her the importance of never giving up, even when a case seemed hopeless. But the case had taken its toll on her too. Chen struggled with nightmares about children in danger. She became overprotective of her own daughter, rarely letting her out of sight. The knowledge of what Margaret Brennan had done to Rebecca haunted her daily work and personal life. She kept Rebecca's photo on her desk. Every case Chen worked, every missing child she searched for, was connected to Rebecca Miller in her mind. The little Amish girl had become the driving force behind Chen's career in law enforcement. She had solved dozens of cases, but none would ever be as important as Rebecca's. Even with Margaret Brennan's confession and conviction, questions about Rebecca Miller's case remained unanswered. Why had Brennan chosen Rebecca specifically? Had she been planning other kidnappings? Were there other victims no one knew about? The answers died with Brennan's fractured mind. Brennan's mental illness made it impossible to trust everything she said. Her memories were mixed with fantasies, and her motivations were buried beneath layers of delusion and trauma. Investigators would never know the complete truth about what happened during Rebecca's final weeks, but perhaps some questions are better left unanswered. The Miller family had closure. They knew where their daughter was, how she died, and who was responsible. The details of Rebecca's captivity would only add to their pain. Sometimes, in cases like this, knowing enough is better than knowing everything. The family chose to focus on healing rather than seeking every painful detail. Rebecca Miller's case was officially closed, but it left a lasting impact on everyone it touched. The red doll that led to solving the case became a symbol of hope for families of missing children. The story reminded people that even the coldest cases can be solved with persistence and new technology. But the deepest questions remain philosophical ones. How does a person meant to protect children become someone who harms them? What drives someone to steal a child from a loving family? How do communities heal from such devastating betrayals of trust? These questions have no easy answers, and somewhere other families are still searching. Rebecca's story ended with answers, but thousands of other children remain missing. Their families continue the agonizing wait that the Millers endured for 9 years. Margaret Brennan is in prison, but other predators walk free, planning their next crime. We're left to wonder how many other red dolls are out there waiting to tell their stories. How many other children are calling for their mothers in the darkness, hoping someone will bring them home? Rebecca Miller's case reminds us that even the most baffling missing person cases can find resolution years later. This true crime mystery shows how one small clue, a doll at a market stall, can crack open a cold case that seemed hopeless. While Rebecca vanished without a trace in 1985, her story demonstrates that families never stop searching and investigators never truly give up on unsolved disappearances. Her case changed how we investigate missing persons and proved that even decades-old mysteries can be solved with persistence and advancing forensic technology. Today, Rebecca's legacy lives on through improved missing person investigations and the countless families who continue their own searches for loved ones who have disappeared without explanation.